We're going now into module 3, which is how to write like Sappho. And we're going to be thinking about Sappho's style and her language, which is obviously a huge category when we're thinking about one of the greatest poets of all time. So I'm going to split style into genre, music, and language. And note that a lot of this is going to link into that discussion about the performance context of Sappho that we discussed in module 1. In fact, if we start with genre in archaic Greece, and that's probably the period, if we sort of delineate it roughly, that's the period just before the classical period, so from around the mid-8th century up until around the early 5th century BC. In archaic Greece, poetry was always performed. It's what Leslie Kirk has called a song culture. And so genre was really derived from the performance contexts of poetry in a way that we might not be familiar with. There were two main performance contexts for archaic poetry: solo, or what's called monodic song, which just means solo singing in Greek. And that would have been the poet or the singer accompanying themselves on the lyre. And that would have taken place in small private gatherings like the symposium, that drinking party that I mentioned earlier. Or on the other hand, there was choral song, where you would have a soloist and alongside them a singing and dancing chorus, and that would have taken place in a large ritual performance setting, particularly the festivals of the gods. And we've already seen how that debate over solo versus choral has really articulated the debate about Sappho's performance. And following Leslie Kirk, we can delineate three main genres that kind of thread through Sappho's poetry. We've got firstly the public ritual songs, like the Adonia. This was a festival to mourn Adonis that was specifically for women. Adonis was a mortal lover of Aphrodite who was gored to death by a boar, and Aphrodite's lament prompted this annual festival by women. There's a brief fragment, fragment 140a, that suggests that we can see a chorus leader or perhaps a soloist in the role of Aphrodite interacting with a female chorus and joining them to mourn Adonis. So this kind of interaction probably in a festival context. We've got wedding songs that could have been both public and private. A large group of Sappho's poetry are wedding songs, which are often known by their Greek term, epithalamia. These could be probably either monodic or choral, depending on the performance context in the wedding ceremony. The wedding ceremony would take place in all kinds of different places. You would have the escort of the bride from her home to the home of the groom. You would then have the bride being taken across a threshold, the arrival of the groom, and all of these different occasions could have occasioned epithalamic poetry. And examples of this are fragments 111 and 112, where you have dialogues between two choral groups anticipating and celebrating the arrival of the groom. And then the third category that defines Sappho's genre are those private love songs. And again, by calling these private, I sort of am falling on one side of the debate. Someone like André Lardinois would say that this was probably a more communal, more public affair. Leslie Kirk, on the other hand, says that they were privately performed. And to me, the way that they're kind of delineated, these very first person, very intimate, very erotic songs that talk about the speaker's encounters in love, that celebrate and sometimes explore these private family dramas, this seems to me to be a more of a sort of a private poetry, and it's probably decontextualized out of those festival and wedding contexts that we saw in the first two genres. And examples of these would be, for instance, fragment 1, the appeal to Aphrodite, the hymn to Aphrodite, fragment 16, which we're going to talk about more, the discussion of her love for Anactoria, and fragment 31, where she describes very famously the experience, the physical experience of being in love. Now, one particular reason that genre is quite difficult to define in Sappho's case is that genre in the ancient world is often connected to gender, where poetry was often public and it was often performed. That was often a very male world. That was where men were seen to belong and women were seen to belong in the private realm. And Sappho, as a female poet, kind of complicates that genre structure, that idea of male poets being out there in the public eye. And so I think we can actually see this in a really productive way, that she's actually often deliberately writing back against these kinds of male public genres, and she's interacting with that public-private sphere and opposition, and using that in kind of quite productive ways. We'll talk more about fragment 16 later. If we move to music, as much as we can revel in and enjoy the incredible beauty of Sappho's poetry, we have to remind ourselves that these poems were performed, and that performance was happening in a musical context. They were being sung to music, and the music is entirely lost to us. So if you kind of imagine encountering Ed Sheeran and all you have are the lyrics, you're kind of going to get some sense of what we've lost here. Now, in fact, there didn't exist a system of musical notation until around the 5th century BC, so it's extremely unlikely that Sappho's music survived even into that classical period that I mentioned around the 5th century. What do we know? What can we reconstruct about Sappho's music? Well, later authors were interested in earlier music, and they talked about the kind of intervals and the scales of Greek music. We know that there were different scales, and the different scales within the Greek kind of musical corpus had different notes and different intervals in them. And Sappho was well known for using what was called the Mixolydian harmonia, harmonia being the Greek word for scale. And these were mixed up scales that drew on her neighbouring Lydia. You'll remember that I talked in module 1 about the fact that she's from Lesbos, so she's very close to the east, close to Lydia, but she mixes them with others, and it was said to be a particularly mournful mode of music. She would probably have accompanied herself on the lyre. That's what we see in all of the depictions of Sappho. We see her holding a lyre, and the lyre would have been tuned specifically to this harmonia, playing the same notes that she was singing. And this is known as homophony. So she would have been plucking the notes on the lyre as she was singing. And those kinds of public performances would have had her as a soloist on the lyre, and then a chorus singing and dancing along to her. So song would have been a very important part of this as well. If we move to zoom in on that language of Sappho, which to me is one of the most exciting things about Sappho, is that kind of sensual, vivid imagery that she uses. There's a real emphasis throughout her poetry on sensory beauty. So colours flash through Sappho's poetry like a rainbow. We've got purple, we've got gold, silver, and several times she mentions this term in Greek, poikilia, which means many-coloured. It's used for the rainbow, but it can also be used for items or artefacts that are intricately worked, intricately embroidered. So it's a real kind of testament to that sensory enjoyment of an intricately crafted, intricately coloured object. And Jane McIntosh Snyder has argued that poikilia, this many-colouredness, is actually deeply emblematic of Sappho's poetry. So one of the reasons that she can make this argument is that the very first word of Sappho's first fragment, which we think probably started the opening book of Sappho's corpus, is poikilothronos, which means many-coloured throned, and it's or rainbow throned, and it's used as an adjective for Aphrodite. Aphrodite, of course, being the symbol and the kind of prototypical goddess of Sappho's love poetry. In fragment 98b, we have Sappho wishing for a many-coloured headband that she can give to her daughter Clais. And in fragment 98a, we hear that that many-coloured headband was the recommendation of Sappho's mother. So in those two fragments, we get this delineated, this very female world, this world that suggests a kind of poetic lineage from Sappho's mother to Sappho to her daughter. Her daughter, of course, with this name, Clais, that sort of ties into Sappho's depiction of glory through poetry, her poetic fame, and then we get this many-colouredness. So it's a really rich term. We also get a more general emphasis on sensory beauty and feeling. And this, of course, ties in with the erotic themes of Sappho's poetry. You get in fragment 31 the vividness and the corporeality of the tongue breaking, the sweat on her skin, the fire, her ears buzzing, and you get that all in response to the face and the voice of the girl that she loves. So this incredibly detailed physical reaction. But you also get an emphasis on beauty as a theme. So I said we talk more about fragment 16, and this is a really programmatic fragment for Sappho, where she talks about what is to kaliston, what is the most beautiful. And she talks back against Homer. She says, it's not troops, it's not cavalry, it's not infantry or ships. The thing that it is most beautiful is the thing that you love. And Sappho here is not only putting beauty to the forefront, but she's also programmatically saying that her erotic poetry, her focus on love, is going to speak back against the kind of military, grandiose, public epic of Homer, and she's going to do something quite different.